Okay, so moving on, we're now on to a session which you can see clearly stated there, Sustainable Travel and the Future of Commuting, the Mood of the Nation. So great pleasure to introduce Lizzie Copp, who is a research director at Ipsos, particularly focusing around transport and infrastructure. Lizzie, over to you.
Thank you. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great, fantastic. Well, thanks so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for joining this session today. I'm going to be talking you through some of the latest polling with the public that we've done here at Ipsos UK in the Social Research Institute. And we'll be showing you the public's underlying opinions and perceptions that might be shaping their attitudes around commuting. So this is very much the kind of wider external context. So I'll start by talking you through what the public see as their top concerns today. We'll zoom in on concern about climate change. We'll be looking at support and opposition among the public towards a few net zero measures and hypothetical policies. And then we'll be looking at what the public think about measures to shift people from the car to other ways of travelling in particular. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what are the most important issues facing the country today in the eyes of the public? If we go to the next slide, please. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, we've got the economy and inflation at the top. And it's been like this for a little while this year. We have NHS as the third top issue that's mentioned by the public. These are spontaneous mentions. And then immigration, that has seen a recent increase in concern among the public. And then pollution, the environment and climate change is there at number 5. Concern about that has dropped comparing August with September. So these are September 2023 figures, but it's still quite high kind of relative to where it has been. So if we go to the next slide to look at the trend data, we can see from this that concern about immigration is on the increase. So that's sort of switched the relative positions of these relative public concerns. We've got concern about economy and inflation, very high there at the right-hand end of the chart. And then the green line is a concern about pollution, environment change. You can see it's been a little bit kind of volatile over the last sort of 2 to 3 years since the pandemic. And it does tend to peak. So it peaked in August. We do see that it peaks when we have severe weather events, when people are seeing wildfires on the news. That big peak there in November 2021 was when there was a storm, but also it was when the COP26 climate conference happened. So we go to the next slide, please. Right, the economic optimism index. Economic optimism is pretty weak at the moment. So we've got a far greater proportion of the British public saying that they think the economy, the economic condition of the country over the next year or so is going to get worse than the proportions who are saying that it will improve or stay the same. And on the next slide, we've got a breakdown of what subgroups think about this. So the lowest levels of economic optimism are seen among Labour voters, lower social grades, 18 to 34 and 35 to 54-year-olds, and renters, remembering that there will be some overlap among the people falling in these subgroups. Next slide. Thank you. So similar thing for concern about the environment. Who's most concerned? Women, Labour voters, higher social grades, and people aged 35 to 44, with some regional variation there as well. Next slide. Thank you. So let's zoom in on this concern about climate change then. Next slide. Right, so it's in September 2023, it's the 5th top concern, the 5th top issue that's mentioned by the public. But that doesn't mean that absolute concern is low. We've got over 3/4 of people at the moment saying that they are concerned about climate change. And you can see that gap between those who are concerned and not concerned. It has been smaller than it is now. The gap's quite wide at the moment. And the next slide also shows a widening gap between those who are saying we are already feeling the effects of climate change versus those who say we're going to be feeling the effects in the next 10 years or longer. And next slide, please. Thank you. So a quarter of us are saying global warming is a serious threat that's out of control, and just over half of us are saying it's a serious global threat, but there is still time to deal with it. Next slide. So how do we deal with it, and what do people think we ought to be doing? So 2/3 of us are saying if individuals like me don't act now to combat climate change, we'll be failing future generations. Nearly as many people are saying if businesses don't act now, they'll be failing their employees and their customers. And 2/3 are also saying if our government doesn't act now, so these are the figures for Great Britain, if the government doesn't act now, it'll be failing the people of Great Britain. But a far smaller proportion are saying that the government has a clear plan in place for how government, businesses and people themselves are going to work together to tackle climate change. So we go to the next slide, please. So opinion is quite split. When we pose the statement to the public, now is not the right time to be investing in measures to reduce climate change given the tough economic conditions. And remembering that fairly weak economic optimism at the moment, and economy and inflation being the top two concerns for the public at the moment. So we have about just over 1/3 of people agreeing with that statement. And then we asked, what do you think will be greater, the economic cost of measures to reduce climate change or the economic cost of climate change itself, or do you think there'll be little difference? So for the latter, 44% said they think the economic cost of climate change itself will be greater. 22% said that measures to reduce it will be greater. So that's quite interesting context there. If we go to the next slide. So nevertheless, people think that we need to do more to fight climate change. 63% are saying that, but a far smaller proportion are saying that our country, Britain, is a world leader in the fight against climate change. Next slide. Thank you. So we also asked the public, and this was back in July, since Rishi Sunak's government was formed in October 2022, do you think the government has done a good or a bad job at dealing with climate change? And the proportion saying that it's done a bad job far outweighs the proportion saying that it's done a good job. The picture doesn't get much rosier, or it wasn't then, when we asked about whether people think a Labour government with Keir Starmer would do a better or a worse job. Only 28% saying that they think it would do a better job. So that polling was done in July 2023. Of course, we've had some announcements relating to green policies since then. So if we go to the next slide, to see what the public think about that. So from what you know or have heard, do you think the government is right or wrong to delay or cancel some of its policies aimed at reducing emissions? And the public are quite split, actually, between those saying it's right and it's wrong. But as you can see, there are differences among subgroups. So Conservative voters are much more likely than Labour voters to say that it was the right decision. And if we go to the next slide, this one, we asked the public, do you think these changes to net zero policies show that Sunak is taking a short-term approach to climate change or a long-term approach? There's not much confidence overall that it's a long-term approach. A quarter of the public thinking that, but far more saying that they think it's a short-term approach. And again, we see this split based on party support. And if we go to the next slide then, please. So do you think these changes to net zero policies will reduce or increase the cost of living to British households, or will it make no difference? Again, it's pretty divided. I mean, the biggest proportion are saying that they think it will make no difference, actually. 22% saying they think it will reduce the cost of living, but much higher among Conservative voters. 27% overall saying they think that those changes will increase the cost of living. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how willing are we as individuals then to take net zero actions and to change our behaviour? Next slide. Right, we posed this statement to the public. There is no point in changing my own behaviour to tackle climate change because it won't make any difference anyway. And 23% agreed with that. A far greater proportion did disagree with the statement. So if we go to the next slide for some more statements for context. So thinking about the actions you personally can take to help fight climate change, what could encourage you to take more action, if anything? And the top one there, sorry, the font is quite small, is a financial incentive or tax cut. So these are different types of measures that are shown here, but perhaps unsurprisingly, that top one is relating to finances. If we look, for example, at social norms, seeing friends, family and neighbours making changes in their own behaviour, that's much lower down, 19%, saying that that would encourage them to take more action. Of course, this is self-reported survey data. What people say might encourage them to change their behaviour might be different to what actually does. If we go to the next slide then. So this was a piece of work that we did with the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, and we posed a whole range of hypothetical net zero measures and policies to people and measured their support and opposition to those policies. So you can see it's a bit of a range here, some travel related, some nothing to do with travel, frequent flyer levies coming out with the highest levels of support among the bunch shown to people, electric vehicle subsidies coming lowest. What we did next in this study was we posed trade-offs to people. So the success of these types of policies will depend on how much we carry on supporting them, if we then think that it might have a lifestyle implication for us, or if it might have a financial implication for us. So if we go to the next slide, this is what happened to levels of support and opposition when we presented a lifestyle implication for each one. So, for example, with frequent flyer levies, we said, and now how much would you support or oppose this as a policy if you couldn't fly abroad very often? And the financial trade-off was if you personally have to pay more for a flight. So support has dropped a bit. One of them, interestingly, support has actually increased for changing product pricing to reflect how environmentally friendly products are. If we said to people, if you were personally not able to buy as much of certain products, like single-use plastics, how much would you support or oppose this? The support actually increased, as I say. So let's go to the next slide and look at what happens to support and opposition when we presented the financial trade-off. So as you can see, support dropped to lower levels for all of them. And actually that product pricing one is the only one that enjoys more support than opposition. So next slide then, please. Another party breakdown, because it's party conference week, so why not? What we can see here is that for each of the measures presented, support is higher among Labour voters than Conservative. Next slide then, please. Okay, so this is quite striking, this battery of questions that we pose to the public. We've got just over half of us saying, I'm too worried about the cost of living to think about the impacts of climate change and the environment. So that's to even think about it. And nearly as many people saying, I'd like to do more to reduce climate change and help the environment, but I can't afford to. So that's much greater than the 29% at the bottom there who are saying, yeah, I find that lifestyle choices that reduce climate change and help the environment are often actually cheaper. So there's perhaps a perceptions thing there to address. If we go to the next slide, please. Right, finally then, attitudes towards reducing the use of cars to try and do other things instead. Next slide. This big figure here is good context for us to bear in mind that just over 7 in 10 of us say that we feel like we need a car to suit our current lifestyle. And that might be to do with personal factors, that might be to do with external factors, where we live, what the public transport networks are like in that area, all sorts of reasons why people feel that they need a car to suit their lifestyle. Next slide then. So 44% agree with the statement that reducing car use would have a significant positive impact on climate change. But 33% say reducing the use of cars will not make much difference to climate change. So that is still a significant proportion saying that. Next slide. A couple more statements on the next slide. We should reduce the use of cars to reduce climate change, even if that makes it more expensive or more difficult for drivers. Just over a third agree with that. Then agreement drops right down when we say we should not make it more expensive or more difficult for drivers to use their cars, even if that's worse for climate change. Next slide. Okay, so what do people think about specific measures to reduce car use then? So nearly 3/4 supporting making it easier to travel by public transport, for example, through reduced prices or investing in more routes. So, plenty of support and appetite for that. Drops a bit when we say to what extent do you support or oppose making it harder to drive by car in some areas to encourage more walking and cycling, for example, through creating more car-free spaces. And then the bottom one, making it more expensive, for people to drive, for example, through a congestion charge or increasing fuel duty, perhaps unsurprisingly with the context, the backdrop in mind of fairly low economic optimism and concern being quite high about the economy and inflation. People are thinking about their finances. Only 31% support that one. Next slide, please. So looking at road user charging specifically, when we ask outright about support and opposition for road user charging with this description here in grey, we find that support still outweighs opposition, but it has weakened since 2020, so between 2020 and 2022. Next slide then, please. What about other things then? Walking, cycling. So over 7 in 10 say that they support actions to encourage more people to walk or cycle instead of driving a car. So that's people answering based on what they would support for other people, including themselves. When we ask them to think about themselves personally, 44% say that they would like to cycle more than they currently do. So that's still a significant proportion, but you can see the differences when we pose statements, getting people to think about everyone in general versus themselves personally. Next slide then, please. So what does this backdrop, what does this context on the mood of the nation mean for sustainable travel and the future of commuting then? So I think the next slide is the final slide. And I'm keeping this fairly top level because I think the other speakers today in the conference will have lots of great recommendations and ideas for what actually needs to happen next. But what does this public polling tell us now about where we are and the context of what we're working with at the moment? So yes, there is concern among the public about climate change. So it was over 3/4 who at the moment are worried about climate change. There is a sense of urgency and imperative that we need to do something about it, even if people are not sure whether now is the right time because of the economic situation. So that's the challenge that we're dealing with. The perceived financial costs of net zero measures, including travel measures, might be seen as a barrier to action. Of course, though, there may be some myths to address there. There may be some perceptions thing to address there, because greener travel can be, in some ways, it can be cheaper. And as we've heard from the previous presentation, there are costs too to traveling by car and sitting in congestion, for example. That's not good for anyone. When it comes to people making decisions about their travel behaviours, anything that's advocating a change in behaviour does, of course, need to win on affordability. And people also value convenience and ease of travel too. So affordability, pricing, cost, and ease and convenience, these are really highly valued by people when they make decisions about how they're going to travel. They need to believe that any change is going to be effective. If they're told this is to lower your carbon footprint and help tackle climate change, the evidence needs to be there that it is actually helping. So people need to believe in it, and it needs to be fair. So we've seen through the presentation, we've seen some subgroup differences. Opinions do differ across the population and between different demographic groups, different attitudinal groups. And people need to believe that it won't pose an advantage to one group in society at the expense of another. It needs to work for everybody. So those are my 3 conclusions. And that's it from me. I think we go over to the panel now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lizzie.